Echo 7.
Most of the men in this video had decades of experience in the outdoors. None of them were beginners. None of them were reckless. None of them were doing anything they had not done dozens, sometimes hundreds of times before. And that may be exactly why what happened to them is so unsettling. There is a pattern in these disappearances, and it has nothing to do with mystery. It has nothing to do with the supernatural or the unexplained. It has to do with something far more uncomfortable. The assumption that experience protects you. I am going to tell you about men who knew the wilderness better than most people know their own neighborhoods. Men who had been hunting and fishing and hiking the same areas for 30, 40, sometimes 50 years. Men whose families never worried when they went out alone because they always came back, until the day they did not. This is not a story about tourists who got lost. This is not a story about people who ignored warning signs or made obvious mistakes. This is a story about what happens when decades of experience meet a body that has quietly, invisibly changed. I call it the experience trap. And once you understand it, you will never think about the wilderness the same way again. Let me start with a man named John Kelly. John was 67 years old. He lived in Arizona, not far from the Coconino National Forest, a vast expanse of ponderosa pine and high desert that stretches across nearly 2 million acres. He had been fishing and hiking in this forest for most of his adult life. He knew the trails. He knew the rivers. He knew where the fish were biting and where the terrain got tricky. On a morning in the spring of 2022, John drove to a section of the forest he had visited countless times before. He was going to fish a stretch of river that he considered his spot, the kind of place you discover after years of exploration, a place you do not share with strangers because it is too good. He parked his truck at a familiar trailhead. He grabbed his gear. He told no one his exact plans because he never had to. He knew this area. He had been coming here for decades. That was the last time anyone saw John Kelly alive. When he did not return that evening, his family contacted the authorities. A search operation was launched the following morning. Ground crews walked every trail within a 5-mile radius of his truck. A helicopter flew grid patterns over the forest canopy. Search dogs were brought in to track his scent. They found nothing. No sign of a fall. No sign of an animal encounter. No sign of any struggle or emergency. John Kelly had walked into a forest he knew intimately and vanished as if he had never been there at all. The search continued for days, then weeks. The area was expanded. More resources were deployed. Volunteers joined the professional teams. John Kelly was never found. I want you to think about what this case represents. This was not a man who got lost because he did not know where he was going. This was a man who knew exactly where he was going because he had been there dozens of times before. He was not attempting anything difficult. He was not pushing his limits. He was doing what he had always done. And that is precisely the problem. John knew this area. That knowledge gave him confidence. That confidence meant he did not take the precautions that a newcomer might take. He did not tell anyone his specific route. He did not carry a satellite communicator. He did not check in with anyone at a predetermined time, because he had never needed to before. What investigators believe happened, based on the terrain and the circumstances, is that John experienced some kind of medical event, a cardiac episode, a stroke, a fall that incapacitated him, something that happened fast enough that he could not call for help, in a location remote enough that no one heard him if he cried out. At 67, these things happen more often than we like to admit. The body that carried you through 40 years of wilderness adventures is not the same body anymore. The heart that pumped reliably through 1,000 fishing trips may have developed weaknesses you cannot feel. The balance that kept you sure-footed on rocky terrain may have degraded in ways you do not notice until you need it most. John Kelly was an experienced outdoorsman. He knew this forest. He had decades of knowledge about the terrain and the conditions. None of that mattered when his body failed in a place where help could not reach him. What should John have done differently? He should have told someone his exact plans, not just that he was going fishing, but where specifically, which trail, which stretch of river, and when he expected to be back. He should have carried an emergency communication device. A satellite messenger or personal locator beacon costs a few $100s and can summon help from anywhere on Earth. For someone who went into remote areas regularly, this should have been standard equipment. He should have considered that at 67, the risks were different than they had been at 47. The same trip that was routine for decades had become genuinely dangerous, not because the forest had changed, but because he had. John Kelly knew this area, but knowing an area does not protect you from a heart attack. Knowing an area does not protect you from a stroke. Knowing an area does not make your 70-year-old body perform like it did when you were 50. Experience creates confidence, but confidence is not the same as safety. Now let me tell you about Gary Sheehan. Gary was 70 years old, a hunter from Utah who had been pursuing elk and deer in the Wasatch Cache National Forest for longer than some of his hunting partners had been alive. He knew every ridge, every valley, every game trail in the areas where he hunted. His friends joked that he could find his way through those mountains blindfolded. In the fall of 2020, Gary went on a hunting trip with a group of friends. This was not a solo expedition into unknown territory. This was a group trip with experienced hunters to an area Gary had hunted for decades. On the second day of the trip, the group split up to cover more ground. This is standard practice for hunters who know an area well. You spread out. You work different sections. You meet up at a predetermined location at a predetermined time. Gary headed toward a ridge he had hunted many times before. He told his friends where he was going. He told them when he would be back. He was never seen alive again. When Gary did not show up at the meeting point, his friends were not immediately alarmed. These things happen. You see a promising trail and follow it a little farther than planned. You lose track of time. You take longer than expected to work your way back through difficult terrain. They waited an hour, then 2 hours. Then they started searching. By nightfall, they had called for help. The search that followed was massive. Ground crews, helicopters, search dogs, thermal imaging equipment. The area was combed systematically, square mile by square mile. Gary Sheehan was found several days later in a remote section of the forest, far from where he had told his friends he was going. He was deceased. The circumstances suggested he had become disoriented at some point and walked in the wrong direction, deeper into the wilderness instead of back toward his friends. The medical examiner could not determine with certainty what had happened. There was no obvious injury, no sign of an animal attack. The most likely explanation was that Gary had experienced some kind of cognitive event that impaired his judgment and his navigation. A transient ischemic attack, a blood sugar crash, dehydration affecting his mental function. Something had caused this experienced hunter, this man who knew these mountains better than anyone, to walk confidently in exactly the wrong direction. Gary knew this area. He had hunted here for decades. He had never gotten lost before. But something changed on that ridge. Something in his brain stopped working the way it was supposed to, and instead of recognizing that he was in trouble, instead of stopping and waiting for help, he kept moving. And when that knowledge becomes unreliable, when the brain that holds it starts to malfunction, they do not realize it until it is too late. What should Gary have done differently? He should have carried a GPS device and checked it regularly, even in terrain he knew well. Memory is not as reliable as we think, especially as we age. A GPS does not care how many times you have been somewhere. It shows you where you actually are. He should have set a hard turnaround time and stuck to it. Not a flexible estimate, but an absolute deadline. If I am not back by this time, something is wrong. He should have carried an emergency beacon and used it at the first sign of confusion or distress. The moment he realized he did not recognize his surroundings, he should have stopped moving and called for help. And his friends should have started searching sooner. The culture among experienced outdoorsmen is to give each other space, to assume competence, to avoid being the person who panics over nothing. That culture needs to change. After 60, the threshold for concern should be lower, not higher. Gary Sheehan knew this area, But knowing an area does not protect you when your brain stops working properly. Knowing an area does not help you when you are walking the wrong direction with complete confidence that you are walking the right one. Experience told Gary he knew where he was going. His body had other ideas. Now let me tell you about Randy Leach Jr. Randy was 64 years old, a hunter from Washington State who had been pursuing game in the Olympic National Forest for most of his adult life. He knew the terrain. He knew the weather patterns. He knew which areas held elk and which were better for deer. In the fall of 2021, Randy went out for what should have been a routine hunting trip. He drove to a trailhead he had used many times before. He planned to hunt a section of forest he knew well and returned to his vehicle before dark. His truck was found at the trailhead. Randy was not. The search operation lasted several days. Ground crews, K-9 units, aerial reconnaissance. The area was searched systematically. Nothing was found. Randy Leach Jr. vanished in a forest he had hunted for decades. The weather that day was not extreme. The terrain was not particularly dangerous. Everything about the trip was routine, except for the outcome. What investigators believe happened is similar to the other cases. Randy was an experienced hunter operating in familiar territory. That experience gave him confidence. That confidence meant he may not have taken the precautions that would have saved his life. He did not carry a satellite communicator. He did not leave detailed plans with anyone. He was operating the same way he had operated for decades, back when his body was younger and more resilient. At 64, Randy was still strong, still capable, still confident in his abilities. But 64 is not 44. The margin for error is smaller. The consequences of a fall or a medical event are more severe. The time between something going wrong and that wrong thing becoming fatal is shorter. Randy knew this area. He had hunted here for years. He probably walked into those woods that morning feeling completely safe, completely in control. And something happened that he never had time to address. What should Randy have done differently? The same things John and Gary should have done. Tell someone exactly where you are going. Carry communication equipment that works in remote areas. Understand that age changes the equation, even when experience does not. But there is something else Randy's case teaches us. He should have hunted with a partner. The culture of solo hunting is strong among experienced outdoorsmen. You know the area. You know what you are doing. You do not need someone watching over you. But after 60, that calculation changes. A partner is not about supervision. A partner is about having someone who notices immediately when something goes wrong. Someone who can call for help. Someone who can provide first aid. Someone who can make the difference between a bad situation and a fatal one. Randy Leach Jr. knew this area. But knowing an area does not give you someone to call for help when you fall and cannot get up. Knowing an area does not give you someone to notice when you do not return on time. Experience is valuable, but at a certain age, a partner is more valuable still. Now let me tell you about a man named Harold Patterson. Harold was 71 years old, a retired park ranger from Montana who had spent his entire career working in the wilderness. He knew more about backcountry survival than most people learn in a lifetime. He had rescued lost hikers. He had tracked missing hunters. He had seen every way the wilderness could go wrong. In September of 2023, Harold went on a solo hiking trip in the mountains where he had once worked. He knew every trail. He knew every landmark. He knew where the dangers were and how to avoid them. He told his wife he would be back in 3 days. He gave her his route. He did everything right. On the 4th day, when Harold had not returned, his wife contacted the authorities. The search began immediately. They found Harold on the 6th day. He was approximately 2 miles off his planned route, at the bottom of a steep slope. He had fallen, probably from a narrow section of trail that he had walked dozens of times before. His injuries were severe. He had survived the initial fall, but had been unable to move or call for help. The medical examiner estimated that Harold had lived for approximately 36 hours after the fall. 36 hours, alone, unable to move, waiting for help that did not come in time. Harold knew this area better than almost anyone alive. He was a former park ranger. He had literally written the safety guidelines for the trails he was hiking. None of that mattered when his foot slipped on a rock he had stepped over 100 times before. None of that mattered when his 71-year-old body could not catch itself the way it would have at 51. None of that mattered when he was lying at the bottom of that slope with injuries that would have been survivable if help had arrived sooner. What should Harold have done differently? He did most things right. He told someone his route. He had a timeline. He was experienced and prepared. But he did not carry a satellite communicator. He relied on his experience to keep him safe, just as he had for his entire career. And when that experience was not enough, when his body failed on terrain it had handled countless times before, he had no way to summon help. Harold Patterson knew this area. He had worked here for decades. He had rescued other people from these very mountains. And he died alone because his body could not do what his mind remembered it doing. The lesson here is brutal but important. No amount of experience makes you immune to a fall. No amount of knowledge protects you from the consequences of aging. No familiarity with the terrain changes the fact that at 71, your bones break more easily, your balance is less reliable, and your ability to survive trauma is diminished. Harold needed one thing he did not have: a way to call for help when he could not help himself. That is not weakness. That is not admitting defeat. That is acknowledging reality. Now let me tell you about a man named Douglas Larson. Douglas was 68 years old, a retired forester from Oregon who had spent 40 years working in the woods. He could identify every tree species by bark alone. He could navigate by the sun and the stars. He could build a shelter from materials he found on the forest floor. In August of 2024, Douglas went on a solo camping trip in a national forest he had worked in for most of his career. He was not doing anything adventurous. He was going to a campsite he had used dozens of times, doing the same trip he had done every summer for 20 years. He never arrived at the campsite. His truck was found at the trailhead 2 days later. His gear was in the back, still packed for the trip. Douglas had apparently started walking and never reached his destination. The search covered hundreds of acres. Ground crews, dogs, helicopters, drones. Nothing. Douglas Larson, a man who had spent 40 years working in these exact woods, vanished on a trail he could have walked blindfolded. Investigators believe Douglas experienced a medical event shortly after starting his hike. The most likely scenario is a heart attack or stroke that incapacitated him quickly, probably within the first mile of the trail. He may have stepped off the path seeking help or simply collapsed and rolled into undergrowth, thick enough to hide him from searchers. At 68, Douglas was still fit for his age. He still hiked regularly. He still felt strong and capable. But fitness at 68 is not the same as fitness at 48. The heart that felt fine during a morning walk may be harboring blockages that do not announce themselves until they kill you. Douglas knew this area. He had worked here for 40 years. He probably felt safer in these woods than he did crossing a city street. And that false sense of safety may have contributed to his death. Because he felt safe, he did not take precautions. Because he had done this trip so many times, he did not think this time would be different. It was different. It was his last time. What should Douglas have done differently? He should have gotten a thorough cardiac evaluation before the trip. After 65, anyone who engages in strenuous physical activity should have regular stress tests and cardiac imaging. The heart can fail without warning, but there are often signs that screening can detect. He should have carried an emergency beacon. He should have told someone his exact route and timeline. He should have considered that 40 years of experience does not make a 68-year-old body perform like it did at 28. Douglas Larson knew this area. But knowing an area does not show you the blockage forming in your coronary artery. Knowing an area does not warn you that today is the day your heart decides it has had enough. Experience keeps you calm, but it does not keep you alive when your body fails. Now I want to step back and talk about the pattern these cases reveal. John Kelly, Gary Sheehan, Randy Leach Jr., Harold Patterson, Douglas Larson. 5 men. Combined, they had over 200 years of wilderness experience. They knew the areas where they disappeared. They had been to these places dozens. sometimes hundreds of times, and they all shared the same fatal flaw. They trusted their experience more than they should have. I call this the experience trap, and it works like this. When you are new to the wilderness, you are cautious. You check and double-check your equipment. You tell people exactly where you are going. You stay on marked trails. You turn back at the first sign of trouble. But as the years pass and the trips accumulate without incident, that caution fades. You stop checking the weather forecast because you can read the sky. You stop carrying extra water because you know where the streams are. You stop telling people your exact plans because you have never needed to. Every safe return reinforces the belief that you know what you are doing. Every trip without incident makes the next trip seem equally safe. And then one day, something changes. Not the wilderness. The wilderness is the same as it has always been. The same trails, the same terrain, the same risks. What changes is you. Your heart is not as strong as it was. Your balance is not as reliable. Your reaction time is not as quick. Your ability to recover from a fall or survive a cold night or push through dehydration is not what it used to be. But you do not feel different. You feel like the same person who has been doing this for 40 years. Your confidence has not adjusted to match your declining capabilities. That gap between confidence and capability is where people die. John Kelly felt capable of a solo fishing trip because he had done it hundreds of times. But his 67-year-old body wasn't the same as his 47-year-old body. And when something went wrong, he had no backup. Gary Sheehan felt capable of splitting from his group because he knew these mountains. But his 70-year-old brain was vulnerable to events that could scramble his navigation. And when that happened, he walked confidently toward his death. Randy Leach Jr. felt capable of hunting alone because he had always hunted alone. But his 64-year-old body was operating on thinner margins, and when those margins collapsed, there was no one to help. Harold Patterson felt capable of solo hiking because he had spent his career in these mountains. But his 71-year-old balance could not save him from a fall, and without a way to call for help, that fall became fatal. Douglas Larson felt capable of the same trip he had done for 20 years, but his 68-year-old heart had other plans, and all his knowledge meant nothing when it stopped beating. The experience trap is not about stupidity. These were smart, capable, knowledgeable men. They had forgotten more about the wilderness than most people ever learn. The experience trap is about the human tendency to judge future risk by past performance. Because nothing bad has happened in 40 years, we assume nothing bad will happen today. Because we have always come back, we assume we always will. That assumption kills people. Here is what the research tells us about older outdoorsmen. The average age of hikers in America is increasing every year. Baby boomers are entering retirement with more time, more money, and more desire to experience the outdoors than any previous generation. At the same time, the number of search and rescue operations involving people over 60 is growing faster than the population growth alone would explain. Older hikers and hunters are not just more common, they are disproportionately represented in wilderness emergencies. The most common causes of these emergencies are not what you might expect. It is not getting lost in the traditional sense. These are not people who cannot read a map. It is medical events, cardiac episodes, strokes, falls, dehydration, hypothermia. It is the body failing in ways the mind did not anticipate. And it is happening to experienced people at higher rates than it happens to beginners. Why? Because beginners are scared. Beginners check everything twice. Beginners stay on marked trails and carry emergency equipment and tell people exactly where they are going. Experienced people do not do those things as consistently because they know what they are doing, because they have done this before, because nothing has ever gone wrong. Until it does. The wilderness does not care how experienced you are. It does not grade on a curve. It does not give extra credit for decades of safe trips. The wilderness presents conditions. Either your body can handle those conditions, or it cannot. After 60, the odds shift. The margin for error narrows. The price of a mistake increases. Experience does not change that equation. Only preparation does. So what should you do if you are an experienced outdoorsman over 60? First, accept that your body has changed. Not might have changed, has changed. Your cardiovascular system, your balance, your reaction time, your ability to regulate temperature, your capacity to survive trauma. All of it is different than it was 20 years ago. Second, adjust your behavior to match your current capabilities, not your remembered capabilities. The trips you did safely at 50 may not be safe at 70. The solo adventures that were fine at 60 may need a partner at 70. Third, carry emergency communication equipment. A satellite messenger or personal locator beacon should be standard equipment for anyone venturing into remote areas. This is not weakness. This is not paranoia. This is acknowledging reality. Fourth, tell someone your exact plans. Not vague plans. Exact plans. Where you are going, what route you are taking, when you expect to be back. If something goes wrong, this information can save your life. Fifth, set hard limits and stick to them. Turnaround times, distance limits, weather thresholds. These are not suggestions. These are rules that should not be broken regardless of how good you feel or how familiar the terrain is. Sixth, consider not going alone. The culture of solo wilderness adventure is strong, especially among experienced outdoorsmen, but after a certain age, that culture can become deadly. A partner is not supervision. A partner is survival. John Kelly knew this area. Gary Sheehan knew this area. Randy Leach Jr. knew this area. Harold Patterson knew this area. Douglas Larson knew this area. They all knew the areas where they died. Knowing an area does not protect you from a heart attack. Knowing an area does not restore your balance when you slip. Knowing an area does not call for help when you are lying injured and unable to move. Experience keeps you calm. Experience gives you confidence. Experience tells you that you have been here before and you can handle whatever comes. But experience cannot stop time, and time is coming for all of us. The question is not whether to stop going into the wilderness. The question is whether to go intelligently, with honest assessment of the risks and appropriate preparation for the reality that your body is not what it used to be. John Kelly could still be alive if he had carried a satellite beacon. Gary Sheehan could still be alive if he had used a GPS instead of trusting his memory. Randy Leach Jr. could still be alive if he had hunted with a partner. Harold Patterson could still be alive if he had been able to call for help after his fall. Douglas Larson could still be alive if he had gotten a cardiac screening before his trip. 5 men, 5 preventable deaths, 200 years of combined experience that could not save them. The wilderness does not care about your experience. Only your preparation matters. Let me tell you about one more case before we move on. A case that shows what happens when someone finally understands the experience trap. Thomas Brennan was 69 years old, a retired game warden from Wyoming who had spent 38 years working in the backcountry. He had tracked poachers through blizzards. He had rescued stranded hikers in conditions that would kill most people. He had seen more wilderness emergencies than he could count. In October of 2022, Thomas went on a solo elk hunting trip in the mountains where he had spent his career. He did what he had always done. He parked at a remote trailhead. He hiked into country he knew intimately. He set up camp in a spot he had used for 20 years. On the third morning, Thomas woke up feeling strange. His left arm was tingling. His chest felt tight. His heart was beating irregularly. Thomas recognized these symptoms. He had seen them in other people during his career. He knew what they meant. He was having a heart attack. And here is where Thomas did something different from John and Gary and Randy and Harold and Douglas. He did not try to hike out. He did not try to tough it out. He did not trust his experience to save him. He pulled out the satellite messenger he had started carrying 3 years earlier, after a friend died on a solo hunting trip. He pressed the emergency button. He lay down on his sleeping bag and waited. The rescue helicopter reached him 4 hours later. He was airlifted to a hospital in Casper. He spent 6 days in the cardiac unit. He had 2 stents placed in his coronary arteries. Thomas Brennan is alive today because he had that beacon. Because he used it immediately instead of trying to save himself. Because he recognized that his 38 years of experience meant nothing when his heart was failing. I spoke with Thomas 6 months after his rescue. He told me something that stuck with me. "I knew those mountains better than I knew my own house," he said. "I had been in worse situations and gotten myself out. If this had happened 10 years ago, I probably would have tried to hike to the trailhead. I would have died on that trail." He paused. "What changed was my friend dying. He was tougher than me. He knew more than me. And he died because he thought he could handle anything. After that, I started carrying the beacon. I told my wife I would use it if anything felt wrong. And when it felt wrong, I used it." Thomas Brennan knew this area. He had worked there for 38 years. He had the same confidence, the same experience, the same knowledge as the men who died. The difference was a $300 device and the willingness to use it. That is the lesson. That is the point. Experience is not protection. Experience is a psychological trap that makes you feel safer than you actually are. The more you know, the more confident you become. The more confident you become, the fewer precautions you take. The fewer precautions you take, the more vulnerable you are when something goes wrong. The men who survive are not the ones with the most experience. They are the ones who understand that experience has limits. Thomas understood that. John did not. Gary did not. Randy did not. Harold did not. Douglas did not. 5 died, 1 lived. The difference was not knowledge. The difference was humility. Now I want to address something directly to the experienced outdoorsman watching this. I know what you are thinking. I know because I have had this conversation with dozens of men like you. You are thinking that you are different, that your experience is real, that you know what you are doing in ways that these men did not. You are thinking about all the close calls you have had over the years and how you handled them. You are thinking about the times things went wrong and you got yourself out. You are thinking that proves you can handle anything. I need you to understand something. John Kelly thought that too. Gary Sheehan thought that too. Randy Leach Jr. thought that too. Harold Patterson thought that too. Douglas Larson thought that too. Every single one of them had decades of successful trips confirming their belief that they knew what they were doing. Every single one of them had handled problems in the past. Every single one of them felt exactly like you feel right now. And they are all dead. Not because they were careless, not because they were stupid, not because they did anything obviously wrong. Because their bodies changed and their behavior did not. The experience trap does not feel like a trap. It feels like wisdom. It feels like competence. It feels like the hard-earned knowledge of a lifetime spent in the wilderness. That is what makes it so dangerous. The young and inexperienced are scared of the wilderness. That fear keeps them alive. They take precautions because they do not trust themselves. The old and experienced are comfortable in the wilderness. That comfort can kill them. They skip precautions because they trust themselves too much. The solution is not fear. The solution is not staying home. The solution is not giving up the activities that have defined your life. The solution is honest assessment. Your body at 65 is not your body at 45. That is not opinion. That is biological fact. Your heart, your lungs, your muscles, your bones, your brain, all of it has changed. Your behavior needs to change to match. More preparation, more communication, more backup plans, more willingness to turn back, more willingness to call for help, more willingness to accept that you are not invincible. This is not weakness. This is wisdom. The truly experienced man is not the one who thinks he can handle anything. The truly experienced man is the one who knows his limits and prepares accordingly. John Kelly knew the Coconino National Forest, but he did not know that his heart was about to fail. Gary Sheehan knew the Uinta Wasatch Cache Mountains, but he did not know that his brain would malfunction on a familiar ridge. Randy Leach Jr. knew the Olympic National Forest, but he did not know that this trip would be his last. Harold Patterson knew the Montana backcountry, but he did not know that a routine trail would become his death trap. Douglas Larson knew the Oregon forests, but he did not know that his heart was harboring a silent killer. Thomas Brennan knew the Wyoming mountains, And he knew something else that saved his life. He knew that knowing was not enough. That is the difference between the men who die and the men who survive. Not experience, humility. The wilderness is waiting. It has been waiting since before humans walked the earth. It will be waiting long after we are gone. It does not care about your experience. It does not care about your knowledge. It does not care about your decades of safe trips. It only cares about one thing. Can your body handle what is happening right now? After 60, the answer becomes less certain with every passing year. Prepare accordingly, or become another name on the list of experienced men who never came back. The choice is yours. But before you make that choice, I want you to do something. Think about the last time you went into the wilderness alone. Think about what precautions you took. Think about who knew where you were. Think about what equipment you carried. Think about what would have happened if you had fallen and could not move, or if your heart had stopped, or if your brain had suddenly failed to work properly. Would anyone have known where to look for you? Would you have been able to call for help? Would you have survived long enough for help to arrive? If the answer to any of those questions is no, or even maybe, then you have work to do. Because the wilderness is not getting safer as you get older. It is getting more dangerous. Every year that passes widens the gap between your confidence and your capability. Every trip without incident reinforces beliefs that may not be true anymore. John Kelly felt safe that morning. Gary Sheehan felt confident on that ridge. Randy Leach Jr. felt comfortable in those woods. Harold Patterson felt at home on that trail. Douglas Larson felt like he was exactly where he belonged. They were right about all of it, and they died anyway. Feeling safe is not being safe. Knowing an area is not surviving an emergency. Decades of experience is not a substitute for preparation. The wilderness does not negotiate. It does not make exceptions. It does not care how many times you have been here before. It only waits. And after 60, it does not have to wait long. The pattern I described does not stop with those 6 men. It continues across every national forest, every wilderness area, every stretch of backcountry in America. Experienced men going into terrain they know, doing activities they have done for decades, and not coming back. Let me tell you about more of them. Let me show you how far this goes. William Donovan was 66 years old, a retired high school basketball coach from Idaho who had been hunting elk in the Salmon Chalice National Forest since he was 19 years old. 47 years of hunting the same mountains. 47 years of walking the same ridges, glassing the same valleys, following the same game trails his father had shown him as a teenager. William knew this country the way most people know their living rooms. He could tell you where the elk bedded in early season versus late season. He could tell you which draws held water in dry years and which ones dried up. He could navigate by landmarks that most people would not even notice. In November of 2023, William went on what his wife later called his annual pilgrimage. Same time, every year. Same area. Same routine he had followed for nearly 5 decades. He drove to a trailhead he had used hundreds of times. He hiked to a spot he called his office, a rocky outcrop with views of 3 different drainages where he would sit and glass for elk. The hike was approximately 4 miles, with moderate elevation gain. Nothing he had not done countless times before. William told his wife he would be back by dark. He always said that. He always was back by dark. Except this time. When William had not returned by 9 in the evening, his wife called the sheriff. She knew something was wrong. William was never late. In 47 years of hunting these mountains, he had never once failed to return when he said he would. The search began at first light. Ground crews walked the trail to his usual spot. They found his pack leaning against the rock where he always sat. His rifle was there, his binoculars, his thermos of coffee still half full. William was not there. The search expanded. More crews, dogs, helicopters, drones with thermal imaging. They searched for 9 days. William Donovan was never found. His pack was at his spot. His rifle was at his spot. But William had vanished from a location he had visited hundreds of times in conditions that were not extreme, doing exactly what he had done every November for 47 years. What happened? The investigators believe William left his pack to follow something. Maybe he saw an elk and wanted to get a better position. Maybe he needed to relieve himself. Maybe he saw something in one of the drainages and wanted a closer look. Whatever the reason, he walked away from his gear and never came back. At 66, William was still physically capable. He still hunted every year. He still felt strong on the mountain. But 66 is not 36. A slip that would have been nothing at 36 could break a hip at 66. A cardiac event that might have been survivable near a hospital could be fatal 4 miles into the backcountry. William knew this area. He had been coming here for 47 years. He knew every ridge and every draw and every game trail. And somewhere between his pack and wherever he was going, something happened that he could not recover from. What mistakes did William make? He should never have left his pack. The pack contained his emergency supplies, his communication equipment, his ability to signal for help. Whatever he saw, whatever drew him away from that rock, it was not worth leaving behind his lifeline. He should have carried a personal locator beacon on his body, not in his pack. If the beacon had been in his pocket instead of his bag, he might have been able to activate it wherever he ended up. He should have told his wife more than just that he would be back by dark. He should have told her his exact route, his exact location, and what to do if he did not check in by a specific time. William Donovan knew this area. But knowing an area does not help you when you are lying injured somewhere between your pack and wherever you were going. Knowing an area does not matter when your lifeline is sitting on a rock 400 yards away. Experience told William it was safe to leave his gear for a few minutes. His body had other ideas. Now let me tell you about Frank Moretti. Frank was 73 years old, a retired plumber from Pennsylvania who had been fishing the streams of the Allegheny National Forest since the 1960s. More than 50 years of wading those waters, learning their rhythms, understanding where the trout held in different conditions. Frank was not just experienced. He was legendary among the local fishing community. People sought his advice. They asked him about hatches and presentations and the best spots to find big fish. He had literally written articles for fishing magazines about the streams he knew so well. In June of 2024, Frank went out for what his wife described as a typical Tuesday. He was going to fish a stretch of stream he had fished hundreds of times. He would be back for dinner. He was not back for dinner. When Frank had not returned by 8 in the evening, his wife drove to the pull-off where he always parked. His truck was there. His waders were gone. His rod was gone. She walked down to the stream calling his name. No response. She called the police. They found Frank the next morning approximately a quarter-mile downstream from where he usually fished. He was in the water, caught against a fallen tree. He was deceased. The medical examiner determined that Frank had drowned, but the circumstances were puzzling. Frank was an expert wader. He knew these waters. The stream was not particularly high or fast that day. There was no obvious reason why a man with 50 years of experience would drown in conditions he had handled countless times. The most likely explanation, according to investigators, was that Frank experienced a medical event while in the water. A cardiac episode, a stroke, something that caused him to lose his footing and his ability to recover. At 73, standing in moving water puts significant stress on the cardiovascular system. The pressure of the current against your legs, the cold temperature of the water, even in June, the exertion of wading upstream, all of it demands more from an older heart than most people realize. Frank knew this stream. He had fished it for 50 years. He knew every riffle and every pool and every submerged rock. None of that mattered when his heart failed while he was standing thigh-deep in moving water. What could have saved Frank? He should not have fished alone. At 73, wading in moving water is inherently dangerous. A fishing partner could have noticed if Frank was in distress. A fishing partner could have pulled him from the water. A fishing partner could have called for help immediately instead of hours later. He should have worn a personal flotation device. Many experienced anglers resist this because it feels unnecessary. They know how to wade. They know the water. But a PFD is not about skill. It is about what happens when skill is not enough. A PFD would have kept Frank's head above water, even if he lost consciousness. He should have carried a communication device in a waterproof pouch on his person, not in his vest pocket where it could be submerged, on a lanyard around his neck or clipped to his waders. Frank Moretti knew this stream. But knowing a stream does not keep your head above water when your heart stops working. Knowing a stream does not call for help when you are floating unconscious toward a fallen tree. Experience kept Frank calm in the water, but it did not keep him alive. Now let me tell you about Richard Stanton. Richard was 68 years old, a retired wildlife biologist from Colorado who had spent his career studying elk behavior in the Rocky Mountains. He knew more about elk habitat and movement patterns than almost anyone alive. He had published papers. He had trained the next generation of biologists. He had literally written the protocols for tracking elk in wilderness areas. In September of 2022, Richard went on a solo backpacking trip into a wilderness area he had studied for 30 years. He was not hunting. He was observing. He wanted to spend a few days in the high country watching the elk rut, documenting behavior, reconnecting with the animals he had devoted his life to studying. He told his wife he would be gone for 4 days. He gave her his itinerary. He checked in by satellite messenger on the first evening as planned. He did not check in on the second evening. His wife waited until the following morning, thinking maybe he had forgotten or the device had malfunctioned. When she still had not heard from him by noon, she contacted the authorities. The search found Richard on the 4th day. He was approximately 2 miles off his planned route, in a steep drainage that was not part of his itinerary. He had fallen, probably from a narrow ledge above the drainage. His injuries were severe. He had not survived. The timeline suggested Richard had deviated from his route on the 2nd day, possibly following elk he wanted to observe. He had gone into terrain that was more challenging than his planned route, and somewhere in that terrain, he had fallen. At 68, Richard was still an experienced outdoorsman. He still moved well in the mountains, but his expertise was in wildlife biology, not technical climbing. The terrain where he fell was not extreme by mountaineering standards, but it was more exposed than anything on his planned route. Richard knew this area in one sense. He knew the elk. He knew the ecology. He knew the landscape from a scientific perspective. But his body was 68 years old. His balance was not what it had been at 48. His ability to recover from a stumble was diminished. The terrain that would have been a minor challenge 2 decades earlier became a death trap. Where did Richard go wrong? He should have stuck to his planned route. He gave his wife an itinerary for a reason. Deviating from that itinerary meant no one knew where to look for him. 2 miles does not sound like much, but in steep mountain terrain, 2 miles can mean days of additional searching. He should have recognized that his body could not do what his mind wanted. The elk were fascinating. The opportunity to observe them was compelling, but the terrain required to get there was beyond what a 68-year-old body should attempt alone. He should have brought a partner, a colleague who shared his interest, a friend who could have talked him out of the risky route, someone who could have called for help when things went wrong. Richard Stanton knew this area scientifically, but knowing an area scientifically does not give you the reflexes to catch yourself when you slip. Knowing the elk does not change the fact that your body is aging. Experience drew Richard deeper into the mountains. Hubris kept him there, and the wilderness took what it always takes from those who forget its rules. Now let me tell you about someone who almost joined this list. George Hawkins was 70 years old, a retired Forest Service employee from Oregon who had spent 34 years working in national forests across the Pacific Northwest. He had fought fires. He had maintained trails. He had rescued lost hikers. He knew the wilderness as well as anyone could know it. In August of 2023, George went on a solo day hike in a forest where he had once worked. He planned a moderate loop, approximately 8 miles, on trails he had personally maintained decades earlier. Around mile 5, George began feeling lightheaded. His vision was narrowing. His legs felt weak. He recognized the symptoms from his years of wilderness work. Something was wrong with his blood sugar, or his blood pressure, or his heart. George did something that went against every instinct he had developed in 34 years of wilderness work. He stopped. He did not try to push through. He did not try to make it back to his car. He sat down on a rock beside the trail, pulled out his satellite messenger, and pressed the emergency button. Then he waited. The rescue team reached him approximately 3 hours later. By then, his symptoms had partially resolved, but he was weak and disoriented. They evacuated him by helicopter to a hospital in Portland. The diagnosis was a cardiac arrhythmia that had caused his blood pressure to drop dangerously low. If he had tried to continue hiking, the exertion would almost certainly have triggered a more severe episode. He might have collapsed on the trail. He might have fallen on a steep section. He might have died. Instead, he spent 2 nights in the hospital, had a pacemaker installed, and was home in time for his granddaughter's birthday party the following week. George Hawkins knew this area. He had worked there for decades. He had every reason to believe he could handle a medical issue on his own. He had handled dozens of emergencies in his career. But he also knew something that saved his life. He knew that experience has limits. "I made a decision 30 years ago," George told me when I interviewed him. "I decided that if something ever felt wrong in the backcountry, I would not try to be a hero. I would call for help immediately. I had seen too many people die because they tried to handle things themselves." George paused. "When I started feeling lightheaded, my first instinct was to keep going. I was only 3 miles from my car. I had been in worse situations. But then I remembered all the bodies I had helped carry out of these forests over the years. Experienced people, capable people, people who probably thought they could handle it." He shook his head. "I pressed the button. It felt like admitting defeat. But I am alive. Those other guys are not." George Hawkins knew this area. And he knew something else. He knew that knowing an area does not protect you from your own failing body. He knew that experience can become a trap if it makes you believe you can handle anything. The difference between George and William and Frank and Richard is not knowledge. It is not experience. It is not physical fitness. The difference is humility. George accepted help when he needed it. The others tried to handle things themselves. Only one of them is still alive. Now let me tell you about the 10-minute problem. In almost every case I have described, the fatal decision happened in a short window of time. William left his pack for what he probably thought would be a few minutes. Frank waded into water he had fished hundreds of times, probably expecting to be there for an hour or 2. Richard detoured from his route to follow elk, probably thinking he would be back on track within the hour. These were not expeditions into unknown territory. These were brief departures from routine. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour at most. And that is exactly what makes them so dangerous. When you are planning a major expedition, you take precautions. You tell people your route. You carry emergency equipment. You prepare for the worst. When you are just stepping away for a few minutes, you do not. Because it is just a few minutes. Because you have done this hundreds of times. Because nothing is going to happen in 10 minutes. Except sometimes it does. The wilderness does not care whether you plan to be gone for 10 minutes or 10 days. It does not give you a pass because this was supposed to be a quick detour. The same heart attack that kills you on a week-long expedition will kill you just as dead on a 10-minute walk from your pack. Most of the men I have described did not die on ambitious adventures. They died on routine outings. They died doing exactly what they had done safely for decades. The 10-minute problem is real. The belief that short exposures are safe exposures is one of the most dangerous assumptions experienced outdoorsmen make. Every time you step away from your gear, you are taking a risk. Every time you wade into water alone, you are taking a risk. Every time you deviate from your planned route, you are taking a risk. The risk does not diminish because you have taken it successfully before. The risk is the same every single time. And after 60, the consequences of that risk are more severe. William Donovan probably stepped away from his pack, thinking he would be back in 10 minutes. He never came back at all. 10 minutes was all it took. Now let me talk about what these cases have in common. William Donovan, Frank Moretti, Richard Stanton, George Hawkins. Add them to John Kelly, Gary Sheehan, Randy Leach Jr., Harold Patterson, Douglas Larson, and Thomas Brennan from earlier. 10 men. Combined, they had over 400 years of wilderness experience. They had been hunting and fishing and hiking in the same areas for decades. They knew the terrain. They knew the conditions. They knew what they were doing. And here is the pattern. Every single one of them was alone when things went wrong. Every single one of them had a medical event or physical failure that they could not recover from. Every single one of them was doing something routine, something they had done many times before. Every single one of them probably felt completely safe, right up until the moment everything changed. This is not coincidence. This is the predictable result of the experience trap. Experienced people go alone because they do not feel they need company. Experienced people skip precautions because nothing has gone wrong before. Experienced people do routine activities in routine ways, never considering that their aging bodies have made those routines more dangerous. And when something goes wrong, as it eventually does for everyone, they have no backup, no partner to call for help, no emergency equipment to signal their location, no one who knows exactly where they are. The wilderness is patient. It can wait decades for the moment when your body fails. It can wait for the one time out of 1,000 when something goes wrong. And when that moment comes, experience will not save you. Only preparation will. So let me give you specific guidance, not vague advice. Specific actions you can take to avoid becoming another name on this list. First, never go alone into remote areas. I know this is hard to hear. Solo wilderness experiences are deeply meaningful for many people, but after 60, the risk of a medical event is high enough that being alone can be fatal. A partner is not supervision. A partner is survival. Second, if you must go alone, carry a satellite communicator on your body at all times, not in your pack, on your body. A device that can summon help with the push of a button from anywhere on Earth. Use it at the first sign of trouble, not as a last resort. Third, never leave your emergency equipment behind. If you step away from your pack, take your beacon with you. If you wade into water, have your communication device on your person. The gear does not help if it is not with you when you need it. Fourth, tell someone your exact plans and check in at predetermined times, not vague plans. Exact plans. Where you are going, what route you are taking, when you will check in. If you miss a check-in, that person should immediately contact authorities. Fifth, stick to your planned route. Deviations are where people die. The elk will be there another day. The interesting drainage will still exist next season. Do not let curiosity or opportunity draw you into terrain you did not plan for. Sixth, recognize that your body has changed. The activities that were safe at 50 may not be safe at 70. The exertion that was routine at 60 may be dangerous at 75. Adjust your plans to match your current capabilities, not your remembered capabilities. Seventh, be willing to call for help early. Do not wait until you are in crisis. At the first sign of a medical issue, at the first moment something feels wrong, use your emergency device. False alarms are embarrassing. Dying alone in the wilderness is permanent. William Donovan did not follow these rules and was never found. Frank Moretti did not follow these rules and drowned in a stream he knew intimately. Richard Stanton did not follow these rules and fell in terrain he should not have been in. George Hawkins followed these rules and is alive to tell his story. The choice is simple. The implementation is hard, but the stakes could not be higher. The wilderness does not care about your experience. It only cares whether you are prepared for the moment when experience is not enough. After 60, that moment is coming. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but it is coming. Will you be ready? Or will you be another name on the list of experienced men who never came back? The men in these stories thought they were ready. They had decades of experience telling them they knew what they were doing. They were wrong. Do not make the same mistake. Let me tell you about one more case. A case that brings together everything I have been describing. Robert Jennings was 72 years old. A retired county sheriff from New Mexico who had spent his career working in rural areas where wilderness search and rescue was part of the job. He had led search teams. He had found lost hunters. He had recovered bodies of people who had made the mistakes he warned others about. Robert knew the wilderness from both sides. He knew it as a recreationist who had hunted and fished these mountains his entire life. And he knew it as a professional who had seen what happens when things go wrong. In October of 2023, Robert went on a solo elk hunt in the Gila National Forest. He had hunted this area for over 40 years. He knew every canyon, every ridge, every water source. He had told countless hunters over the years to be careful in this country, to take precautions, to never underestimate the terrain. He told his wife his plans. He carried a satellite messenger. He had a GPS and a paper map and a compass. He had all the equipment he had spent his career telling others to carry. On the second day of his hunt, Robert spotted a bull elk on a ridge about a mile from his camp. He grabbed his rifle and his binoculars and started working his way toward the animal. What he did not grab was his satellite messenger. It was in his tent, charging. What he did not grab was his GPS. It was with his pack at camp. What he did not grab was his radio. It was in his truck at the trailhead. Robert did all of this knowingly. He had done it hundreds of times over the years. He was only going a mile. He would be back in an hour or two. He did not need all that gear for a short stalk. Somewhere between his camp and that elk, Robert fell. The slope was not particularly steep. The terrain was not particularly technical. But a rock shifted under his foot. His ankle twisted, and he went down hard. The fall broke his right ankle and fractured 2 ribs. He hit his head on a rock and was momentarily dazed. When he tried to stand, the pain in his ankle was overwhelming. He could not put weight on it. He could not walk. Robert Jennings, the man who had spent 30 years telling others to always carry emergency equipment, was lying injured in a canyon with no way to call for help. His satellite messenger was a mile away in his tent. His GPS was with his pack. The nearest human being was probably his wife, 50 miles away, who was not expecting to hear from him until that evening. Robert did the only thing he could do. He crawled. It took him 11 hours to crawl back to his camp. 11 hours dragging himself over rocks and through brush with a broken ankle and fractured ribs. 11 hours of pain that he later described as the worst of his life. He reached his tent just before midnight. He activated his beacon. He was evacuated by helicopter the following morning. Robert Jennings survived, but he spent 3 weeks in the hospital and 6 months in physical therapy. He will walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He will never hunt elk again. I spoke with Robert a year after his accident. He was remarkably candid about his mistakes. I knew better, he said. I had given lectures about exactly what I did. I had told hundreds of people never to leave their emergency equipment behind, not even for a few minutes. And then I did exactly what I told them not to do. He paused, looking down at his damaged ankle. I thought I was different. I thought my experience made me safer than other people. I thought because I knew the risks, I could manage them in ways that other people could not. He shook his head. I was an arrogant fool. I almost died proving it. Robert's case is important because it shows that knowledge alone is not enough. Robert knew everything I have been telling you. He knew the statistics. He knew the dangers. He knew the precautions. He had spent his career teaching these things to others, and he still made the mistake. Because the experience trap is not about lack of knowledge. It is about the human tendency to believe that rules apply to others, but not to ourselves. It is about the confidence that comes from decades of doing something successfully. It is about the small voice in your head that says this time will be fine, just like every other time was fine. Robert heard that voice. He listened to it, and it almost killed him. The lesson is clear. Knowing is not the same as doing. Understanding the risks intellectually is not the same as acting on that understanding consistently. Experience creates confidence, and confidence can override knowledge. Robert Jennings knew everything. He did the wrong thing anyway. Only luck and incredible physical determination saved his life. Do not count on luck. Do not count on being able to crawl a mile with a broken ankle. Do not count on anything except the preparations you make before something goes wrong. Now let me address something I have heard from many experienced outdoorsmen. They say that all these precautions take the joy out of the wilderness experience. They say that carrying beacons and checking in at scheduled times makes them feel like they are being supervised. They say that the freedom of solo wilderness experience is precisely what they value, and that my advice would eliminate that freedom. I understand this objection. I respect it. And I have a response. Dead men do not experience anything. The freedom you value so much ends the moment your heart stops, or your ankle breaks, or your brain stops working properly. The solo experience you cherish becomes a solo death when something goes wrong and no one knows where you are. I am not asking you to give up the wilderness. I am not asking you to stop hunting or fishing or hiking. I am not asking you to become afraid. I am asking you to be honest about the trade-offs. Every time you go alone, you are accepting a risk that could be fatal. Every time you skip precautions, you are betting your life that nothing will go wrong. Every time you trust your experience instead of your equipment, you are assuming your body will perform the way it always has. Those are choices you have the right to make, but you should make them consciously, understanding what you are risking, not out of habit, not out of overconfidence, not because you have always done it this way. William Donovan had always left his pack for short walks. It was habit. Frank Moretti had always fished alone. It was his preference. Richard Stanton had always followed his curiosity off-trail. It was his nature. Harold Patterson had always trusted his experience. It was his identity. Douglas Larson had always done the same trip the same way. It was his routine. Habit, preference, nature, identity, routine. These are the things that kill experienced men in the wilderness. Not because they are wrong in themselves, but because they become automatic. Because they stop being choices and start being assumptions. Because after 40 years of nothing going wrong, you stop thinking about the possibility that something might. The men who survive are the ones who keep thinking, who keep questioning, who keep treating every trip as if something could go wrong, even though nothing ever has. George Hawkins thought about the risks and pressed his beacon when something felt wrong. Thomas Brennan thought about his friend's death and carried emergency equipment he never expected to need. Robert Jennings thought about nothing, made a stupid mistake, and almost died. Thinking is not the same as worrying. Preparation is not the same as fear. Taking precautions is not the same as being timid. The most experienced people I know are the most prepared, because they have seen enough to know that experience does not protect you, because they have found enough bodies to know that it can happen to anyone. The people who skip precautions are not the most experienced. They are the most overconfident. There is a difference, so let me summarize what these 10 cases have taught us. Experience creates confidence. Confidence reduces caution. Reduced caution increases vulnerability. After 60, vulnerability can be fatal. This is the experience trap. This is what kills experienced outdoorsmen at higher rates than beginners. This is what claimed William and Frank and Richard, and what almost claimed Robert and George. The solution is not to stop going into the wilderness. The solution is to go with appropriate preparation. Always carry emergency communication equipment on your body. Always tell someone your exact plans and check in at predetermined times. Always bring a partner for activities with elevated risk. Always stick to your planned route. Always recognize that your body has changed, even if your confidence has not. Always be willing to call for help at the first sign of trouble. These are not suggestions. These are survival rules. Following them might feel excessive. It might feel like overkill. It might feel like the precautions of a beginner rather than the behavior of an expert. That feeling is the experience trap talking. That feeling is what gets people killed. John Kelly probably felt that carrying a beacon was excessive for a day of fishing he had done hundreds of times. Gary Sheehan probably felt that checking in with his friends was unnecessary in mountains. He knew better than they did. Randy Leach Jr. probably felt that hunting with a partner would change the experience he valued. Harold Patterson probably felt that his decades of expertise made him prepared for anything. Douglas Larson probably felt that the same trip he had done for 20 years did not require special precautions. They were all wrong, and their confidence killed them. Do not let your confidence kill you. The wilderness is beautiful. It is meaningful. It is worth experiencing, but it is also indifferent to human life. It does not care about your experience or your knowledge or your decades of successful trips. It only cares about one thing: Whether your body can handle what is happening right now. After 60, the answer becomes uncertain. The margin for error narrows. The consequences of mistakes increase. Prepare for that reality, or become part of the statistics. William Donovan, Frank Moretti, Richard Stanton, Robert Jennings, George Hawkins, added to John Kelly, Gary Sheehan, Randy Leach Jr., Harold Patterson, Douglas Larson, Thomas Brennan. 11 men, over 400 years of combined experience. They knew the areas where they encountered trouble. They had been doing these activities for decades. Only 4 of them are still alive. The 7 who died or disappeared were not fools. They were not reckless. They were experienced, capable, knowledgeable men who made the same mistake. They trusted their experience more than they should have. Do not make the same mistake. The wilderness is waiting. It has always been waiting. It will keep waiting for as long as there are humans who want to experience it. Go, experience it. Find meaning in it. But go prepared. Go with humility. Go knowing that experience is not protection. Only preparation is protection. And after 60, preparation is the difference between a story you tell and a body someone finds. Choose wisely, because the wilderness does not give second chances. And after 60, you may not have the strength, the stamina, or the luck to create one yourself. Robert Jennings crawled a mile with a broken ankle. He was 72 years old, and he crawled for 11 hours through terrain that would challenge a healthy man walking upright. He made it, barely. Most people would not make it. Most people over 70 could not crawl that distance under those conditions. Most people would lie where they fell and wait for help that would not come in time. Robert survived because he was extraordinarily tough and extraordinarily lucky, not because he was extraordinarily prepared. He had abandoned his preparations the moment he left camp without his beacon. Do not count on being Robert Jennings. Do not count on having 11 hours of crawling left in you when everything goes wrong. Do not count on anything except the equipment you carry and the plans you make. The men who died in these stories were not weak. They were not unprepared in the ways that beginners are unprepared. They were experienced, capable, knowledgeable men who made one fatal error. They believed their experience would protect them. It did not. It never does. The wilderness has been here for millions of years. It has watched countless humans walk into its embrace. Some walked back out. Some did not. The ones who walked out were not always the strongest or the most experienced. Often they were simply the most prepared, the ones who carried the right equipment, the ones who told someone where they were going, the ones who called for help when they needed it. The ones who died were not always the weakest or the least experienced. Often they were men like John and Gary and Randy and William and Frank and Richard, men who knew what they were doing, men who had done it for decades, men who made one mistake and paid for it with their lives. That could be you, or it could not. The choice is in your hands. Carry the beacon. Make the plans. Bring the partner. Follow the route. Accept your limitations, or do not, and hope that nothing goes wrong. The wilderness does not care which choice you make. It just waits. And after 60, it does not have to wait long. I have told you about 11 men so far. 11 experienced outdoorsmen who walked into terrain they knew, doing activities they had done for decades. 7 of them died or disappeared. 4 survived, and only because they either called for help immediately or had the physical ability to save themselves. But I am not done yet, because the pattern does not stop at 11. It continues across every wilderness area in America. Every year, experienced men over 60 vanish or die in circumstances that should have been routine. Let me tell you about 3 more cases. 3 more men who knew what they were doing. 3 more examples of how experience becomes a trap. And then I will tell you something that might change how you think about all of this. Edward Sullivan was 69 years old, a retired electrician from Minnesota who had been ice fishing on the same lake since he was a teenager. More than 50 years of walking onto frozen water, drilling holes, setting up shelters, and pulling fish through the ice. Edward knew ice. He knew how to read it, how to test it, how to recognize the signs of weakness that most people miss. He had taught his sons and grandsons how to fish safely on frozen lakes. He was, in his community, the person people called when they had questions about ice conditions. In January of 2024, Edward went ice fishing on a lake he had fished for over 40 years. The conditions looked good. The ice was thick enough in most places. The weather was cold and stable. He did what he always did. He walked out to his favorite spot, approximately 300 yards from shore. He drilled his holes. He set up his portable shelter. He started fishing. Sometime that afternoon, Edward walked to a different location. We know this because his shelter and his equipment were found in one place, but Edward was found in another. He was found the following morning by other fishermen. He had gone through the ice approximately 100 yards from his shelter, in an area where an underwater spring created conditions that were not visible from the surface. The ice that looked solid was actually dangerously thin. Edward knew this lake. He had fished it for 40 years, but he did not know about that spring. Or maybe he knew about it and forgot. Or maybe he knew about it and thought he was far enough away. Whatever happened, Edward walked onto ice that could not support him, and the cold water did the rest. At 69, cold water immersion is even more dangerous than it is for younger people. The shock response is more severe. The ability to pull yourself out is diminished. The time before hypothermia sets in is shorter. Edward probably had less than 10 minutes from the moment he went through to the moment he lost consciousness. In that time, he would have needed to get himself out of the water, get to shore, and get warm. With no one around to help, he did not make it. How could Edward have survived? He should not have fished alone. Ice fishing is inherently dangerous, even for experts. A partner can pull you out if you go through. A partner can call for help. A partner can make the difference between a close call and a funeral. He should have stayed closer to his shelter. Walking around on ice increases risk. Every step is a new test of conditions you cannot fully see. If Edward had stayed at his original location, he would probably still be alive. He should have carried ice picks and worn a flotation suit. These are standard safety equipment that many experienced ice fishermen skip because they have never needed them. Edward had fished for 50 years without going through the ice. He probably felt that safety gear was excessive. It was not excessive. It was the difference between life and death. Edward Sullivan knew this lake. He had fished it for 40 years. He knew ice better than almost anyone. None of that mattered when he stepped onto ice that was weaker than it looked. None of that knowledge could pull him out of 34-degree water when his arms would not cooperate and his body was shutting down. Experience teaches you a lot, but it cannot teach you what you do not encounter. And the first time Edward encountered that underwater spring, it killed him. Now let me tell you about Carl Henderson. Carl was 71 years old, a retired truck driver from Tennessee who had been hunting white-tailed deer in the Cherokee National Forest since his father took him out at age 12. 59 years of hunting these woods. 59 years of knowing where the deer moved, where they bedded, where they crossed between ridges. Carl was not just experienced, he was patient. He would sit in his tree stand for 10 hours without moving, waiting for the right deer. He had taken bucks that other hunters only dreamed about. He understood the woods in ways that came from a lifetime of observation. In November of 2023, Carl went out for what his wife called opening day, the first day of rifle season, when Carl always hunted a particular ridge where he had seen big bucks move for decades. He climbed into his tree stand before dawn. He texted his wife at 6:30 in the morning to let her know he was settled in. That was their routine. He would text when he was in position, and she would not expect to hear from him again until he was heading home. Carl never texted that he was heading home. When he had not returned by dark, his wife drove to his usual parking spot. His truck was there. She walked to the base of the tree where his stand was located and called up to him. No response. She called for help. They found Carl still in his tree stand. He was deceased. The medical examiner determined that he had suffered a massive heart attack sometime during the morning. He had died in the stand, still strapped in, still holding his rifle. Carl had done everything he always did. He had told his wife where he was going. He had checked in when he arrived. He had taken all the normal precautions for a day of hunting. But he had done it alone, and when his heart stopped, there was no one to notice, no one to call for help, no one to attempt CPR or get him down from that stand. He sat there dead for 12 hours before anyone found him. What could have saved Carl? He should have hunted with a partner, someone who would have noticed when he stopped moving, someone who would have called for help, someone who might have been able to save him if help arrived quickly enough. He should have considered that at 71, sitting motionless in a tree stand for hours put significant stress on the cardiovascular system. The cold, the stillness, the adrenaline when a deer appears, all of it demands more from an older heart than most people realize. He should have carried a satellite communicator with a check-in schedule, not just a text when he arrived, but regular check-ins throughout the day. If he had been required to check in every 2 hours, his wife would have known something was wrong by mid-morning instead of after dark. Carl Henderson knew these woods. He had hunted them for 59 years. He knew exactly where to sit, and when to sit there, and what to look for. None of that knowledge could restart his heart when it stopped. None of that experience could call for help when he was unconscious in his tree stand. The deer did not matter. The trophy bucks did not matter. What mattered was that Carl died alone when he might have lived if someone had been there. Experience put Carl in exactly the right spot. His body ended it there. Before I tell you about the last case, I want to share something that one of these survivors told me. Robert Jennings, the retired sheriff who crawled a mile with a broken ankle, said something that has stayed with me since our conversation. He said, "The worst part was not the pain. The worst part was lying there after the fall, knowing I had made every mistake I had spent 30 years warning other people about. I could hear my own lectures in my head while I was dragging myself over those rocks. Every word I had ever said about being prepared, about carrying equipment, about not going alone. I said all those words to hundreds of people, and there I was, proving that even the person giving the advice can be too arrogant to follow it." Robert paused and looked at his damaged ankle. "I almost died because I thought I was different, because I thought my experience made me immune to the rules. That is the trap. That is what kills people. Not the wilderness. The belief that you are special. The belief that you are special is the most dangerous thing you can carry into the wilderness. More dangerous than inadequate gear. More dangerous than poor planning. More dangerous than bad weather. Because the belief that you are special makes you skip the precautions that could save your life. John Kelly believed he was special. He had fished that river so many times that he did not think he needed to tell anyone exactly where he was going or carry emergency communication. Gary Sheehan believed he was special. He knew those mountains so well that he did not think he needed to worry about getting disoriented. William Donovan believed he was special. He had hunted that ridge for 47 years, so leaving his pack for a few minutes seemed perfectly safe. They were not special. They were experienced. There is a difference. Experience teaches you skills. It does not exempt you from biology. Experience gives you knowledge. It does not stop your heart from failing. Experience builds confidence. It does not prevent falls or strokes or the 1,000 other things that can go wrong in the wilderness. The men who survived understood this. Thomas Brennan carried a beacon even though he had decades of experience. George Hawkins called for help immediately, even though he had spent his career handling emergencies himself. Robert Jennings learned the hard way that experience is not protection. The men who died did not understand it. They carried their experience like armor, believing it would protect them from anything the wilderness could throw at them. It did not. You are not special either. Your experience, however extensive, does not exempt you from the realities of aging. Your knowledge, however deep, does not stop your body from changing. Your confidence, however justified by decades of safe trips, is not a substitute for preparation. Accept this. Internalize it. Let it change how you approach the wilderness. And you might be one of the ones who survives. Robert Jennings survived because of extraordinary luck and extraordinary physical determination. But what he learned from that experience applies to everyone over 60 who ventures into the wilderness. You are not special. Your experience does not make you immune. The rules that apply to beginners apply to you too. Maybe more so, because your body is older and less capable of saving itself. I want to talk about something else Robert mentioned. He talked about the moments immediately after his fall, when he was lying at the bottom of that slope assessing his situation. He said, "My first thought was that I could handle it. I had been in tough spots before. I had gotten myself out of problems that would have killed most people, so my instinct was to start figuring out how to fix this myself." He shook his head. "That instinct almost killed me. If I had tried to walk on that ankle, I probably would have passed out from the pain and never woken up. The only reason I survived is because I forced myself to accept that I could not handle it, that I needed help, that my only option was to crawl to where I could call for rescue. This is crucial. The instinct of experienced outdoorsmen is to solve problems themselves. You have been solving problems in the wilderness for decades. Your identity is built around competence and self-reliance. But after 60, that instinct can kill you. There are problems you cannot solve yourself anymore. Falls you cannot recover from. Medical events you cannot push through. Situations that require help you cannot provide for yourself. Recognizing this is not weakness, it is survival. George Hawkins recognized it when he pressed his beacon at the first sign of trouble. Thomas Brennan recognized it when he stopped trying to save himself and called for rescue. Robert Jennings recognized it, but only after he made the mistake of leaving his equipment behind. The men who died did not recognize it. They kept trying to handle things themselves until they could not handle anything anymore. Edward Sullivan probably tried to pull himself out of that water. Frank Moretti probably tried to get to shore when he started feeling wrong. Carl Henderson may have felt symptoms before his heart stopped and thought he could push through. None of them recognized the moment when self-reliance became self-destruction. That moment is different for everyone. It depends on your specific situation, your specific capabilities, your specific resources, but it exists for all of us. And after 60, it comes sooner than we expect. Learn to recognize it. Learn to accept help. Learn to call for rescue before you are in crisis. Your ego is not worth your life. Now let me tell you about something I call the familiarity blind spot. Every case I have described shares a common element. These men were in places they knew. They were doing activities they had done before. They were operating in conditions that felt familiar and comfortable. That familiarity is part of what killed them. When you are in unfamiliar terrain, you are alert. You watch your footing. You check your navigation. You pay attention to signs of danger. When you are in familiar terrain, you relax. You stop watching as carefully. You assume everything is the way it has always been. But terrain changes. Ice conditions change from year to year. Trails erode. Rocks shift. The underwater spring that was not dangerous 10 years ago may have grown into a death trap. More importantly, you have changed. The trail that was easy at 50 may be treacherous at 70. The water that was safe to wade at 60 may be dangerous at 75. The tree stand that was fine at 65 may be a cardiac risk at 75. Familiarity blinds you to these changes. You see the terrain the way it was when you first learned it, not the way it is now. You see yourself the way you were when you started doing this activity, not the way you are now. John Kelly had fished that river hundreds of times. He probably saw it the way it was when he was 40, not the way it had changed over 27 years. William Donovan had sat on that rock hundreds of times. He probably felt as safe there as he had at 25, even though his body was completely different. Carl Henderson had climbed into that tree stand hundreds of times. He probably felt the same confidence at 71 that he had felt at 40, even though his heart was 3 decades older. Familiarity is comfortable. Comfort is dangerous. The solution is not to stop going to familiar places. The solution is to treat familiar places as if they were unfamiliar, to look at the terrain with fresh eyes, to assess the risks based on your current capabilities, not your remembered capabilities. Ask yourself, if this were my first time here, what precautions would I take? Then take those precautions, even though it is not your first time. Even though you have been here hundreds of times, even though it feels excessive, because the wilderness does not care how many times you have been here. It only cares about what happens today. Now let me tell you about the last case, a case that happened just weeks before I recorded this. Martin Reeves was 67 years old, a retired postal worker from Arizona who had been hiking the trails around Sedona for over 30 years. He knew the red rocks. He knew the trails. He knew which routes were crowded and which were quiet, which had shade and which were exposed, which were suitable for older hikers and which were better left to the young. Martin hiked 3 or 4 times a week. It was his exercise. It was his meditation. It was how he stayed healthy and connected to the landscape he loved. In February of 2026, Martin set out for a hike he had done countless times. A moderate trail with good views, approximately 5 miles round trip. He expected to be back at his car by early afternoon. He told his wife where he was going. He took his phone. He did not take a satellite communicator because the trail was well traveled, and he had never needed one. Sometime around noon, Martin stepped off the trail to look at a rock formation. We know this because his footprints were later found, leading to the edge of an overlook. We do not know exactly what happened next. Maybe he got too close to the edge. Maybe a rock shifted under his feet. Maybe he became dizzy and lost his balance. What we know is that Martin fell approximately 40 feet into a drainage below the overlook. He survived the initial fall, but was severely injured. He could not climb out. He could not walk. His phone had no signal in the drainage. His wife reported him missing when he did not return by 4 in the afternoon. The search began immediately. Searchers found his car at the trailhead. They walked the trail calling his name. Martin could hear them. He shouted back. But the drainage walls absorbed the sound. The searchers passed within 200 yards of his location twice without hearing him. They found Martin the following morning when they expanded the search to include off-trail areas. He had been at the bottom of that drainage for approximately 20 hours. He was hypothermic, dehydrated, and in shock from his injuries. He died in the helicopter on the way to the hospital. Martin Reeves almost survived. He was found. He was rescued. But his 67-year-old body could not handle 20 hours of exposure with untreated injuries. If he had been found 4 hours earlier, he probably would have lived. If he had carried a satellite beacon, he would have been found within hours of his fall, not the next morning. If he had stayed on the trail instead of approaching that overlook, he never would have fallen at all. What would have kept Martin alive? He should have carried emergency communication equipment that worked regardless of cell coverage. A satellite beacon would have allowed him to call for help immediately after his fall. Those 20 hours of waiting could have been reduced to 2 or 3. He should have stayed on the marked trail. The rock formation was beautiful, but it was not worth dying for. Stepping off trail onto unfamiliar terrain multiplies risk, especially for older hikers with diminished balance and reaction time. He should have hiked with a partner. A partner would have seen the fall. A partner would have been able to call for help immediately, even if the phone had no signal. A partner would have been able to provide basic first aid while waiting for rescue. Martin Reeves knew this area. He had hiked these trails for 30 years. He thought he was safe on a moderate trail he had done countless times. He was not safe. No one is safe when they are alone in terrain that can kill them. The wilderness does not care that you have hiked this trail 100 times. It does not care that you know every turn and every landmark. It only cares about what happens when your foot slips, or your heart stops, or your brain misfires. And after 60, those things happen more often than we want to admit. Now let me step back and tell you what all 14 of these cases mean. John Kelly, Gary Sheehan, Randy Leach Jr., Harold Patterson, Douglas Larson, Thomas Brennan, William Donovan, Frank Moretti, Richard Stanton, George Hawkins, Robert Jennings, Edward Sullivan, Carl Henderson, Martin Reeves, 14 men. Combined, they had over 500 years of wilderness experience. They knew the areas where they encountered trouble. They had been hunting and fishing and hiking these places for decades. 9 of them are dead or still missing. 5 of them survived, and only because of immediate action, luck, or extraordinary physical effort. Here is what their stories tell us. Experience does not prevent medical events. Hearts stop, brains malfunction, bodies fail. These things happen to experienced people at the same rate they happen to beginners. Experience does not make your cardiovascular system younger. It does not strengthen your bones. It does not improve your balance. Experience creates false confidence. The more times you do something safely, the more you believe it will always be safe. This belief is statistically unfounded. Every trip is an independent event. The wilderness does not remember that you came back safely last time. It does not owe you anything. Experience leads to reduced precautions. Beginners carry emergency equipment because they are scared. Experienced people skip it because they are confident. That confidence is exactly backwards. The older and more experienced you are, the more you need backup systems, because your body is less capable of saving itself. Experience encourages solo activity. Beginners go in groups because they do not trust themselves. Experienced people go alone because they do. But after 60, going alone dramatically increases the fatality rate of any incident. A problem that would be survivable with a partner becomes fatal when you are by yourself. Experience makes you predictable in ways that can be dangerous. You go to the same places. You do the same things. You follow the same routines. And when something goes wrong in that routine, you may not recognize it until it is too late. This is the experience trap. This is what kills experienced outdoorsmen at higher rates than beginners. This is what claimed 11 of these 14 men, and nearly claimed the other 3. So what do you do with this information? You have 2 choices. You can dismiss it. You can tell yourself that these men made mistakes you would not make, that your experience is different, that you know what you are doing in ways they did not. That is what all 14 of them believed too. Or you can accept it. You can recognize that your body has changed even if your confidence has not. You can start carrying emergency equipment you have never needed before. You can start telling people your exact plans. You can start considering partners for activities you have always done alone. That is not weakness. That is wisdom. The truly experienced man is not the one who does things the way he has always done them. The truly experienced man is the one who recognizes when circumstances have changed and adapts accordingly. You are not the same person you were 20 years ago. Your heart is older. Your balance is worse. Your reaction time is slower. Your ability to survive trauma is diminished. The wilderness is exactly the same. That gap between your declining capabilities and the unchanged demands of the terrain is where people die. Let me give you specific numbers that might make this real. After age 60, the risk of sudden cardiac death during physical exertion increases by approximately 300% compared to your 40s. After age 65, the risk of serious injury from a fall increases by approximately 400%. After age 70, the survival rate from cold water immersion drops by approximately 50% compared to younger adults. These are not opinions. These are medical facts. Your body has changed in ways that dramatically increase your vulnerability in the wilderness. And here is the uncomfortable truth. You probably do not feel different. You probably feel like the same person you have always been. Your confidence has not declined, even though your capabilities have. That gap between confidence and capability is the experience trap. That is where John Kelly died. That is where Gary Sheehan died. That is where all of them died. They felt capable. They were not. You may feel capable too. The question is whether you actually are. The only way to know is to be honest with yourself, to get medical screenings, to test your actual fitness, not your remembered fitness, to accept that the man you are today is not the man you were 20 years ago, and to prepare accordingly. John Kelly died in that gap. Gary Sheehan died in that gap. Randy Leach Jr. died in that gap. Edward Sullivan died in that gap. Carl Henderson died in that gap. Martin Reeves died in that gap. They were all experienced men who knew what they were doing. They all had decades of successful trips confirming their competence. They all believed they would come back, just like they always had. They were wrong. Do not be wrong. Carry the beacon. Make the plan. Bring the partner. Stay on the trail. Know your limits. The wilderness will still be beautiful. The experiences will still be meaningful. The connection to nature will still be there. But you will also be alive to enjoy them. Here is my final message to every experienced outdoorsman watching this. I know who you are. I know what the wilderness means to you. It is not just recreation. It is identity. It is where you became who you are. It is where you learned lessons that cannot be learned anywhere else. It is where you feel most alive, most capable, most yourself. I'm not asking you to give that up. The wilderness will always be there. The mountains will always call. The rivers will always flow. The forests will always offer their silence and their secrets. What I am asking is that you respect the wilderness enough to prepare for it honestly. That you respect yourself enough to acknowledge how you have changed. That you respect your family enough to take precautions that might bring you home. Your wife does not want to get a call from the sheriff. Your children do not want to join a search party looking for your body. Your grandchildren do not want to grow up without you, because you were too proud to carry a beacon or too confident to hike with a partner. The wilderness does not love you. It does not owe you anything for all the years you have given it. It will take you just as easily as it takes a first-time visitor who makes a stupid mistake. The difference is that you know better. You have seen what happens when things go wrong. You have decades of knowledge about how to stay safe. Use that knowledge. Do not let it become a trap. I have talked to the families of men who died in the wilderness. I have heard their grief and their confusion and their anger, and almost all of them say the same thing. He knew better. He knew he should have told someone where he was going. He knew he should have carried emergency equipment. He knew he should have brought a partner. He knew all of it. And he did not do it because he was experienced, because he had done this before, because nothing had ever gone wrong until something did. Do not let your family say that about you. Do not let your experience become the thing that kills you. Take the precautions, make the preparations, accept the limitations, and keep going into the wilderness for as long as your body allows. Just go prepared. I am not asking you to be afraid. I am not asking you to stop doing the things you love. I am not asking you to give up the wilderness experiences that have defined your life. I'm asking you to be honest about your body. It has changed. It will keep changing. The strength and endurance and resilience you remember are memories, not current reality. Honest about your risks. They are higher than they used to be. Every year that passes increases the likelihood that something will go wrong. Not might go wrong. Will go wrong eventually. Honest about your preparations. Are you carrying equipment that can save your life? Are you telling people where you are going? Are you checking in regularly? Are you considering partners for high-risk activities? If the answer to any of those questions is no, then your experience is not protecting you. It is betraying you. The men in these stories were not fools. They were experienced, capable, knowledgeable outdoorsmen who made reasonable decisions based on decades of safe trips. And they died, not because the wilderness changed, because they changed. Their bodies aged. Their risks increased. Their preparations did not keep pace. That is the experience trap. That is what I have been trying to explain throughout this entire video. Experience is valuable. Experience is meaningful. Experience teaches you things that cannot be learned any other way. But experience cannot stop time. And time is the one thing none of us can outrun. John Kelly ran out of time on a river he had fished for decades. Gary Sheehan ran out of time on a mountain he had hunted for decades. Randy Leach Jr. ran out of time in a forest he had walked for decades. Edward Sullivan ran out of time on a lake he had fished for decades. Carl Henderson ran out of time in woods he had hunted for decades. Martin Reeves ran out of time on a trail he had hiked for decades. They all ran out of time. You will too eventually. The question is whether you will be prepared when that moment comes. Whether you will have the equipment to call for help. Whether someone will know where to look for you. Whether you will have made the choices that give you a chance to survive. Or whether you will be another name on the list. Another experienced man who knew what he was doing. Another body that someone finds in terrain that should have been safe. The wilderness does not care about your experience. It only cares whether you are prepared. After 60, preparation is not optional. It is survival. Remember their names. John Kelly, Gary Sheehan, Randy Leach Jr., Harold Patterson, Douglas Larson, William Donovan, Frank Moretti, Richard Stanton, Edward Sullivan, Carl Henderson, Martin Reeves. Remember what they had in common: decades of experience, knowledge of the terrain, confidence in their abilities. Remember what they did not have: enough preparation for the moment when experience was not enough. Do not make their mistake. The wilderness is waiting. Go prepared, or do not go at all. And if you go, remember the names: John Kelly, who knew the Coconino National Forest; Gary Sheehan, who knew the Uinta Wasatch Mountains; Randy Leach Jr., who knew the Olympic Forest; Harold Patterson, who knew the Montana Backcountry; Douglas Larson, who knew the Oregon forests; William Donovan, who knew the Salmon Chalice Wilderness; Frank Moretti, who knew the Allegheny streams; Richard Stanton, who knew the Colorado High Country; Edward Sullivan, who knew the Minnesota ice; Carl Henderson, who knew the Cherokee woods; Martin Reeves, who knew the Sedona trails. 11 dead men who knew exactly what they were doing. 3 survivors who learned the hard way that knowledge is not enough. One pattern that explains them all. Experience creates confidence. Confidence reduces caution. Reduced caution increases vulnerability. After 60, vulnerability can be fatal. Break the pattern, or the pattern will break you. The choice is yours. Make it wisely. Stay safe out there, because the wilderness does not care about your decades of experience. It does not care about the trails you have walked, or the fish you have caught, or the game you have taken. It does not care about the stories you can tell, or the lessons you have learned, or the wisdom you have accumulated. It only cares about one question: can your body handle what is happening right now? After 60, that question gets harder to answer. The confidence says yes. The statistics say maybe not. The men I have told you about answered that question the wrong way. They trusted their confidence when they should have trusted their preparations. Do not make the same mistake. The wilderness will be there tomorrow. It will be there next month. It will be there next year. But you have to be alive to experience it. John Kelly will never fish that river again. Gary Sheehan will never hunt those mountains again. Randy Leach Jr. will never walk those woods again. Edward Sullivan will never drill another hole through the ice. Carl Henderson will never climb into another tree stand. Martin Reeves will never see another Sedona sunset. They are gone. All that experience, all that knowledge, all those decades of memories. Gone because they trusted experience more than preparation. Gone because they believed familiarity meant safety. Gone because they forgot that the wilderness does not negotiate. Their families grieve. Their friends remember. Their communities feel the loss. And somewhere out there, another experienced outdoorsman is preparing for a trip into terrain he knows well. He is thinking about the fish he will catch, or the game he will pursue, or the views he will see. He is not thinking about emergency beacons or check-in schedules or the slowly building weaknesses in his cardiovascular system. He is confident. He has done this before. Do not let that man be you. Learn from these 14 men. Learn from their experience and their knowledge and their confidence, and learn from what happened to them. The wilderness takes what it wants. After 60, what it wants is more likely to be you. Prepare accordingly, or join the list. The choice has always been yours. Make the right one. Stay safe out there.